The Project Gutenberg ebook of the 42nd, East Lancashire, Division 1914 to 1918. This ebook is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this ebook or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this ebook. Title: The 42nd, East Lancashire, Division 1914 to 1918. Author: Frederick P. Gibbon. Release date: May 5, 2024. Ebook number 73544. Language: English. Original publication: United Kingdom, George Newlands, Ltd., 1920. Credits: Brian Coe and the online distributed proofreading team at https://www.pgdp.net. Start of the Project Gutenberg ebook. The 42nd, East Lancashire, Division 1914 to 1918. The 42nd, East Lancashire, Division 1914 to 1918. First published in 1920. Printed in Great Britain by Richard Clay and Sons, Limited. Brunswick St, Stamford St, SE1, and Bungay, Suffolk. Major General Sir W. M. Douglas, KCMG, CB, DSO. By permission of Liddell Sawyer. The 42nd, East Lancashire, Division 1914 to 1918. By Frederick P. Gibbon. Author of The Lawrences of the Punjab. London. Published at the offices of Country Life, Ltd. 20 Tavistock Street, Covent Garden, WC2, and by George Newlands, Ltd., 8 to 11 Southampton Street, Strand, WC2. New York, Charles Scribner's Sons. To the officers, warrant officers, non-commissioned officers, and men of the 42nd, East Lancashire, Division. As their late commander, I dedicate this history of their achievements, conspicuous even in days of great deeds, in the hope that the record of their unchanging spirit of courage, loyalty, and comradeship may give gratification to survivors and solace to relatives of the fallen. November 11, 1920. Major General A. Solly Flood, CB, CMG, DSO. By permission of Keturah Collings. Forward. The 42nd, East Lancashire, Division was only a comparatively short time under my command, but during that period officers N.C.O.S. and men showed themselves to be possessed of a magnificent fighting spirit. The 42nd Division came to France at a time of crisis, and shared in the glory of breaking the most desperate and most dangerous German offensive made since the early days of the war. In my dispatches I have drawn attention to some of the outstanding actions of the division. I am glad now to express to all ranks my personal gratitude for their splendid service. Field Marshal GHQ. The Forces in Great Britain. Horse Guards, London, SW1. July 14, 1919. Preface. Sir William Douglas asks me to write a few lines to be embodied in the preface to a history of the 42nd Division. In the regions of time and space, the Dardanelles enterprise forms only a trifling part of the record of this famous division. But, in the sphere of the imagination, that part will be reckoned by Lancastrians yet unborn as the most precious heirloom bequeathed to them by the generation who fought the Great War. Why? I will give the reasons in the words of a gallant young Australian killed shortly after he wrote me as follows from the front. In France, I often compare the two situations, out here and on those wild romantic shores of the Aegean. I compare them and I find that the Peninsula War stands quite alone and apart, an ineffaceable memory. Bearing in mind that I am limited to a few lines, I propose to think out nothing new, but to repeat now what was jotted down about a sample of the 42nd Division at the time, the June 4, 1915. In my post of command, shared that day with two enormous tarantulas. On the right the French rushed the haricot so long a thorn in their flesh, next to them the Anson lads stormed another big Turkish redoubt in a slapdash style reminding me of the best work of the old regular army, but the boldest and most brilliant exploit of the lot was the charge made by the Manchester Brigade in the centre, who wrested two lines of trenches from the Turks, and then, carrying right onto the lower slopes of Achi Baba, had nothing between them and its summit but the clear, unentrenched hillside. They lay there, the line of our brave lads, plainly visible to a pair of good glasses. There they actually lay. We wanted, so it seemed, but a reserve to advance in their support and carry them right up to the top. We said, and yet could hardly believe our own words, we are through. Alas, too previous that remark, everything began to go wrong. First the French were shelled and bombed out of the haricot, next the right of the Naval Division became uncovered, and they had to give way, losing many times more men in the yielding than in the capture of their ground. Then came the turn of the Manchesters, left in the lurch, with their right flank hanging in the air. By all the laws of war they ought to have tumbled back anyhow. But by the laws of the Manchesters they hung on and declared they could do so forever. General Lieutenant of the Tower of London. September 1, 1919. The foregoing words were written by the Commander-in-Chief, under whom the 42nd, East Lancashire, Division went into action for the first time of its existence. It is nearly a year now since Sir Ian Hamilton wrote them. This will give the reader some idea of the gigantic task those who have collected the material for, and the writer of, this book have had. The work is an attempt to record the doings and follow the fortunes of the 42nd, East Lancashire, Division in the Great War. But nothing that can be written can adequately disclose the noble manner in which these lads preserved throughout that dogged courage and insistent resolution from which it was impossible, for those who were present, to withhold their admiration. My own 4 years' experience of them has left me with the deepest feelings of pride and affection. From first to last they proved themselves to be gallant, loyal, and self-sacrificing soldiers, warm-hearted, responsive, and lovable men. The thanks of the committee responsible for the publication of this book are due to Captain E.R. Street and Mr. George Bigwood, who collected much of the data, but more especially to Mr. F.P. Gibbon, who so kindly consented to write the history. The labor of collecting information from war diaries and comparing the various accounts which so many old members of the division have been kind enough to send him, has been very great, and we owe Mr. Gibbon a debt of deep gratitude. August 7, 1920. The committee and the author wish to record their warm appreciation of the assistance given in the compiling of this history by many officers, non-commissioned officers, and men of the division. As the final proofs of the book were being passed, there came the sad news of the death of the 1st Divisional Commander, Major General Sir William Douglas, KCMG, CB, DSO, at Cults, near Aberdeen, on November 2, 1920. He had come to be regarded as the father of the division. It was under him that it earned the distinction of being the first territorial division to leave these shores, and under him it received its baptism of fire. Even when he had passed from command both during the war and after, hostilities had ceased, his interest in the welfare of all ranks remained unabated, and the affection he felt towards them was warmly reciprocated. In expressing their deep sorrow and their sympathy with Lady Douglas, the committee feel that they may speak for all ranks and all services of the division. Contents. Chap. Page. I. Lancashire and Egypt, August 1914 May 1915. 1. 2. Gallipoli, May 1915. 19. 3. Gallipoli, June 1915 January 1916. 34. 4. The Suez Canal and Sinai, January 1916 March 1917. 63. V. France, March-August 1917. 86. 6. Ypres, September 1917. 97. 7. Newport, October-November 1917. 106. 8. La Bassée, December 1917 March 1918. 114. 9. Opening of the German offensive, March 21 April 8, 1918. 128. X. André Cte, April 9 August 20, 1918. 142. 11. The Beginning of the End, August 21 September 6, 1918. 155. 12. Through the Hindenburg Line, September 7-30, 1918. 171. 13. Across the River Selle, October 9-23, 1918. 179. 14. Foret de Mormel and Haute-Mont, November 3-11, 1918. 191. Roll of Honor. 200. Honors and Awards. 232. Headquarters Staff and Officers Commanding Units. 242. Key map showing approximate positions of battle fronts occupied by the 42nd Division, E. Lanks. T. Movements from outbreak of war until armistice. 1914 to 1915. September-May. British Army of Occupation in Egypt, and on Suez Canal defences. 1915 to 1916. May-Jan. MEF. At Cape Helles, Gallipoli Peninsula. 1916 to 1917. EEF. Suez Canal defences and Sinai Peninsula. January-Feb. Advance through Romani to El Arish. 1917. February and March. BEF. Arrived at Marseilles and proceeded to neighborhood of Abbeville. May. In the line at Epie and L'Empire. June. Have Rincourt and Trescalt. August and Sept. Ypres. Sept. Coast Sector, Newport Bains. October, November. Newport and St. George's. November, December, January, February, 1918. Opposite La Bassée. 1918. March, April. Ervilers, Buckhoy. May, June, July. Buckhoy, Gamicourt, Hebuterne. August. Advanced through Miramont, Rancourt, Villers-aux-Flots. Sept. Have Rincourt to Welshridge. October. Esens, Beauvois, across Arcelle. November. Le Quesnoy, Mormel Forest to Haute-Mont. November 11th. Stood fast on line of Maubeuge-Avicens Road. Illustrations. Facing page. Major General Sir W. M. Douglas, KCMG, CB, DSO. Frontispiece. Major General A. Solly Flood, CB, CMG, DSO. 4. Cap WT4 Shaw, VC, 19th BN Manchester Regiment. 46. Lieutenant A.V. Smith, VC, 1/5th BN East Lancs Regiment. 57. PTE. W. Mills, VC, 1/10th BN Manchester Regiment. 116. SGTE Smith, VC, DCM, 1/5th Lancs Fuss. 157. L.C. Corpay Wilkinson, VC, 1/5th BN Manchester Regiment. 187. Lieutenant COLPV Holberton. 131. The Divisional Commander and Brigadiers. 242. Egypt and Suez Canal. 18. Gallipoli, Sea Hellies and Crythionula Sector. 19 to 29. Sea Hellies and Gully Ravine Sector. 48 to 60. Sinai Peninsula. 76 to 83. Colored Plate, Divisional Flashes. 84. Belgium, Ypres Sector. 98 to 104. Nieuport Sector. 105 to 108. France, La Bassée Sector. 114 to 118. The German Offensive, March 1918. 130 to 131. Gamicourt Hebuterne Sector, April-August 1918. 142. The British Advance, Miramont-Trescalt. 148 to 166. The Hindenburg Line. 172. Across the Arcelle. 182 to 186. Foret de Mormel and Hautmont. 192. Maps. Key map. X. Gallipoli, Cape Helles. 22. Trench map. 34. France, the German Offensive, 1918. 128. The British Advance, 1918, First Stage. 171. Final Stage. 179. The 42nd, East Lancashire, Division. Chapter I. Lancashire and Egypt. August 1914 – May 1915. For a week or two there had been talk of war and of the likelihood of England being involved. The prospects and possibilities formed an interesting topic of conversation and speculation. We leaned over the sheer side of the precipice and caught glimpses of the black chasm below, but few really doubted the soundness of the fence over which we peered. Warnings of disaster had been frequent, but disaster had always been averted, and fair words had prevailed. For years we had been living on the verge of national ruin through strikes of railwaymen, transport workers, miners, or the spinners and weavers of Lancashire. But at the last moment conciliation always won. There was always room for compromise. Though civil war in Ireland seemed imminent, it was comforting to reflect how much common sense there was in the world. Besides, had it not been proved to everyone's satisfaction that under modern conditions war between great nations could not possibly last for more than a month or two, as in that short period victor and vanquished would alike be reduced to bankruptcy and impotence. Knowing this, no great power would be likely to commit suicide. We were living in the 20th century, and a great European war was an abstract conception, not something that could actually occur. In the closing days of July 1914 this complacency was giving way to a very real dread. War might mean suicide even for the victor, might be unthinkable, but it was inside plain, stark, menacing. War such as other nations had known, not a war in which those who had a taste for soldiering might take part while the Rest of us could read about it in the papers, feel proud of a success, and depressed by a disaster, and wonder whether sixpence would be added to the income tax. The fantastic image that had thrilled us not altogether unpleasantly as children experience ecstatic shudders when listening to tales of ogres and hobgoblins was taking on an appearance of grim reality. Could it after all be a grisly spectre and not a mere bogey of turnip and white sheet? England began to regret that the warnings of her greatest soldier had passed unheeded. A day or two later Germany flung down her challenge to Christianity and civilization, stripped herself of the cloak of decency and stood revealed in stark brutishness, and on Tuesday, August 4, 1914, England took up the challenge and declared war. The decision was apparently not expected by the German staff. To them it was rather a matter for exasperation than for apprehension. England had her hands full at home, and her vast possessions would prove a source of weakness. She had a small regular army, a force with high traditions, well trained and well equipped for service on the frontiers of India and other outposts of the empire, containing a larger proportion of officers and men with experience of actual fighting than any other army of the great powers, yet so small in numbers and so scattered over the face of the globe, that one can almost sympathize with the German belief that the few thousand men who could be spared from the duty of policing India, Egypt, South Africa, and other possessions, might safely be regarded as negligible. She had, too, a small, indifferently trained and equipped, unprofessional home defense force, but even the British themselves did not take the territorials seriously. As to the rest of the potential fighting material of the British Isles, had it not been proved to the satisfaction of the Germans, who had made a special study of such matters with the typical Teutonic thoroughness which works so efficiently when applied to material facts, and fails so lamentably when the human factor enters, that the young manhood of the nation was mainly decadent, of poor physique, weak-chested, half-educated, lacking in patriotic purpose, with no thought of the morrow and no ideals. With the exception of the few hundred thousands who had received some training in physical drill and discipline in the Boys' Brigade and its daughter organizations, which teach discipline, self-respect, and esprit de corps, or in the school cadet corps, all were utterly untrained, and they hated discipline. England had clearly shown that she was too selfish to submit to any form of compulsory service, too wrapped up in the love of comfort, ease and luxury to do more than bribe fools to die for her. It was a nation that had lost its soul. The military aid she could give to France could be contemptuously brushed aside. When France had been paralysed and the Channel ports secured, the British mercantile marine could be sunk or scared off the seas, and the British Empire brought to its knees. Teutonic reasoning was wrong. The British character is too simple or too complex for the Hun. It may be that no other nation brings so much froth to the top as ours, that none extends such tolerance to cranks, nor gives so much rope to little cliques of shrieking egoists, nor shows such stolid indifference when the few, claiming to speak on behalf of the nation, so egregiously misrepresent her. On August 5, 1914, it was seen that practically every man, woman and child approved what the government had done, and felt instinctively that their country would have been shamed had there been a day's hesitation. England had found her soul, not lost it. A nation supposed to consist largely of pleasure seekers, of lovers of compromise, conciliation, and tolerance, of comfort and luxury, had decided that all it held most dear would be as dust and ashes if it stood aside, a passive spectator of the agony of France and Belgium. Practically without a dissentient voice, the nation prepared to sacrifice its all. Unhappily, the politicians, unaccustomed to realities, were not ready to make the most of this spirit of sacrifice. Unable to leave their grooves of finesse, intrigue, and opportunism, they knew not how to appeal simply to the noblest instincts, so they talked of business as usual, and attempted to cajole the nation into giving a part when the whole was ready to be offered. Composition of the division. This is the story of the part played in the most appalling of human tragedies by the East Lancashire Territorial Division, which, on leaving England, was composed of the following units: Cavalry, A Squadron, Duke of Lancaster's Own Yeomanry 6. Officers, 132 men. RFA, the 1st, Blackburn, and the 3rd, Bolton, East Lancashire. Brigades 55 officers, 1,289 men. RE, 1st and 2nd Field Companies and Signal Company 19. Officers, 568 men. Infantry, the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Battalions, the Lancashire. Fusiliers 120 officers, 3,962 men. The 4th and 5th Battalions, the East Lancashire Regiment 60. Officers, 1990 men. The 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th Battalions, the Manchester Regiment 180 officers, 5,966 men. ASC, 3 companies and the Transport and Supply Column 16. Officers, 276 men. RAMC, 3 field ambulances 30 officers, 665 men. Total, including divisional and brigade headquarters 511. Officers, 14,966 men. The 12 battalions of infantry were brigaded as follows: the Lancashire Fusiliers Brigade, the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Battalions, Lancashire Fusiliers. The East Lancashire Brigade, the 4th and 5th Battalions, East Lancs Regiment, and the 9th and 10th Battalions, Manchester Regiment. The Manchester Brigade, the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Battalions, Manchester Regiment. The 5th LF was mainly composed of men from the Bury district. The 6th from Rochdale, the 7th and 8th from Salford, the 4th E Lancs from Blackburn, the 5th from Burnley, the 5th Manchesters from Wigan, the 6th and 7th from Manchester and its suburbs, including a good proportion from the Cheshire suburbs, the 8th from Ardwick and East Manchester, the 9th from Ashton-under-Lyne, the 10th from Oldham. The 1st RFA Brigade, Blackburn, was composed of the following batteries: the 4th, Blackburn, the 5th, Church, the 6th, Burnley. The 3rd RFA Brigade, Bolton, of the following: the 18th, 19th, and 20th, all from Bolton and district. Many of these units date back to 1859, when the volunteer movement came into being. For 41 years the volunteers were an untried force, but in the year 1900 their offers of service in the South African War were accepted, the infantry battalions providing detachments which served with credit in that campaign. It was not until 1907 that serious thought was given to the equipment and organization of this fine body of patriotic men. Lord Haldane's territorial scheme, based on the model of the regular army, did more than change the name from volunteers to territorials. Major General Douglas Haig, Director of Military Training at the War Office, had charge of the scheme, and in bringing about this great change, he gave evidence of the foresight and grasp of essentials, which in 1918 enabled him to lead the armed strength of the Empire to victory. The various batteries, battalions, and corps, no longer scattered and independent units, were organized and trained as divisions, and the force was actually treated as a valuable and even essential element in the system of national defense, with the result that the territorial force soon reached a higher state of efficiency than the volunteers had ever been permitted to approach. The East Lancashire Division had the reputation of being one of the smartest and most efficient of the whole force. Mobilization. On August 3, units in camp for their annual peace training were recalled, and the order to mobilize the division was received at 5:30 p.m. on the following day. Probably few members of the territorial force had realized that their calling up notices had been ready from the day they joined, that month by month the addresses on the envelopes were checked and altered when necessary, that enough ball ammunition was stored at the various headquarters to enable every man to march out with the full complement of a fighting soldier, and that field dressings were available for issue. It must be remembered that never before had the force been embodied, and that officers and men were civilians, few of whom had ever regarded mobilization as other than a remote possibility quite outside the range of practical politics. Yet the absence of confusion was remarkable, as all ranks threw themselves into their new parts with zest, making the best of unusual conditions and treating discomfort as a jest. The men were quartered in drill halls or schools within easy reach of their headquarters. Major General Douglas, commanding the division, with his general staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel A.W. Tufnell, was daily at the divisional headquarters in Manchester, or at the headquarters of units, supervising the mobilization and arrangements. These have been described as hectic days. Improved though the organization was as compared with that of the volunteers, it was anything but complete. Animals and vehicles for transport, harness, and an infinite variety of requisites had to be procured by free purchase or by commandeering in great haste. This was the weakest part of the scheme, and though much ingenuity was displayed by officers unaccustomed to this sort of thing, the waste was great. To such shifts were they reduced that street watering carts were bought from urban district councils and actually taken to Egypt. Among the weird varieties of carts thus acquired, one of the best remembered is the black and green van, which did duty as a medical officer's vehicle, and was last seen bleached by the sun, but with the original lettering still traceable under the service grey, at Gaberi Docks, Alexandria in February 1917. Nothing could better illustrate the inability of a large and patriotic section of the public to grasp the significance of events than the expectation freely expressed by vendors that their horses or carts would be returned to them in the course of a few weeks. In some cases the drivers of requisitioned animals joined the territorial unit in order to remain with their horses. On August 10 Lord Kitchener invited the territorial force to volunteer for foreign service. By August 12 the 3 infantry brigades had accepted the invitation, and within a few days 90% of the East Lancashires eagerly seized the opportunity. England saw with pride the keenness of the territorials to meet the enemy, and knew that her sons were true to the breed. For more than 50 years she had treated her citizen army as something that must not be taken too seriously, but that is England's way. The response was magnificent, but it was expected, for the nation never doubted that they would answer the call. It was no small gift they offered. The most powerful army the world had ever seen was moving forward victoriously towards Paris, remorseless and apparently irresistible, and the territorials offered their bodies for death and mutilation, and gave up parents, wives, children, homes, prospects, and all they held most dear. At a later period such sacrifice was demanded as the nation's right, but in August 1914 a lead had to be given, an example set. Old volunteers were not content to look on while the younger generation fought and suffered. Daily a stream of old members, N.C.O.S. and men, many in the autumn of their lives, besieged the headquarters of their old corps and clamored to be allowed to join up, lying cheerfully and brazenly in respect of their age. Many gained their object, more were almost broken-hearted by their rejection. The example set in those dark days was a stimulus and incentive to recruiting all over the country, and especially so in the great towns of Lancashire, where the PALS battalions were soon to be raised. It was the vindication of the volunteer. Defense, not defiance, had been their motto, but who among the prescient founders and bulwarks of the movement could ever have conceived the idea of the glorious role to be filled by the corps they had helped to raise of the old volunteer units from every county and city, at full strength, fighting and laying down their lives in Belgium, France, Egypt, Gallipoli, Palestine and Greece, and taking an inspiring part in the greatest of all crusades against the Turk? Until August 20 officers and men remained within easy reach of their headquarters. The division was then moved into camps in the neighborhoods of Bolton, Bury and Rochdale, and anxiously it awaited the summons. Another fortnight passed, and the rumor that Egypt was to be the destination began to gain ground. Rumor was, however, at this time a discredited jade, fit subject for scorn. For was she not responsible for the passage through England and Scotland of myriads of Russian soldiers, the ice and snow of Archangel still clinging to their boots and beards, who had been seen by thousands of British optimists at every railway junction in the land? But in the training camps of East Lancashire she was restored to public favour when a telegram, dated September 5, was received by the divisional commander from Lord Kitchener. Inform the division from me that I hope that they will push on hard with their training in Egypt, as, before they are ready, there will be plenty of troops from India to garrison Egypt, and I hope they will be one of the first of the territorial forces to join our army on the continent. All will depend on their fitness for service against the enemy in the field. Kitchener. General Douglas spoke for every man in the division when he replied, "All ranks much gratified to receive your message. They are animated with keen desire to fit themselves to join our forces on the continent." On the September 9 the division entrained for Southampton. About 40 trains being required to convey men, horses, guns, and all the material of war, and on the 10th 15,500 Lancashire men, with about 1,000 officers and men of the Hertfordshire and City of Westminster Yeomanry, embarked upon the great adventure. The first territorial division to volunteer for foreign service, and the first to leave England's shores. It was a record of which the Lancashire men were justly proud, and which secured to them from the start the prestige and esprit de corps that are usually the outcome of long and honourable tradition. The details that were not going out with the division became the nucleus of the second line, which sent drafts to the first line until about the end of August 1915, when the second line East Lancashire, 66th Division, was formed. After that date the drafts came from the third line units. The Duke of Lancaster's own yeomanry had been accepted for voluntary service overseas, and it had been hoped that the whole regiment would accompany the division, but finally only a squadron was ordered to embark. Departure for Egypt. It was midnight when the troop ship steamed out of the harbour. A dark night, all lights doused, no coastwise lights to guide, the blackness stabbed by scores of searchlights. The troops on board. One of the ships began to sing and the whole convoy took up the strains. In the morning the first arrivals lay to off the Eddystone. Until, by late afternoon, a great fleet had assembled. At sundown, the convoy sailed in 3 lines ahead, escorted by the battleship Ocean and the cruiser Minerva. It is said that this was the first actual convoy that had left England since the Napoleonic Wars. The rough weather of the first 3 days and much unavoidable discomfort aboard ship were borne with cheerfulness. The men had the impression that they were sadly overcrowded, but subsequent experience of life in cubbyholes and dugouts modified their ideas of what lack of space really means. It was noticed that even the worst sufferers from seasickness never lost hope, as, although whole messes did not eat a meal during those 3 days, the daily indent for 1 bottle of beer per man was always drawn, to be saved for happier days. Rumors of the presence of enemy craft off Portugal gave rise to a pleasing sense of excitement and risk, but nothing happened. Early on September 17 the mighty rock of Gibraltar loomed suddenly out of the mist, and soon the mystical, sun-scorched, tawny hills of northern Africa were sighted. From Gibraltar the convoy was escorted by the Minerva only. As the weather improved it was found that, in spite of the crowded life aboard the troop ships, quite a lot of theoretical training, and even a certain amount of physical, could be given, and there was little time for leisure in the Mediterranean. One brilliant day, after Malta had been passed, the sight of a great fleet sailing towards the west caused much excitement. Soon the news spread that this was the Lahore division bound for Marseille's war-hardened Sikhs. Gurkhas, Dogras, Punjabis, Pathans, and Rajputs, all eagerly looking forward to the day when they should cross steel with the famous soldiers of Germany, and confident of the result of such meeting. After exchange of greetings and of escorts, the Weymouth taking the Minerva's place, flags were dipped and adieus waved. It was a wondrous sight, this great gathering of mighty ships, carrying tens of thousands of men and all their material of war from east to west and from west to east, an object lesson of the strength and resources of the empire. On the September 25th, a misty, languorous morning, the low, sandy coast of Egypt, fringed with surf, with here and there a clump of palm trees, was sighted. It was the Egypt of anticipation, curiously familiar even to men whose travels had rarely taken them beyond the confines of Lancashire. As the troop ships slowly entered Alexandria harbor they passed a battle cruiser of the U.S. Navy. Though a strict neutrality had to be maintained in respect of action, there was no attempt to observe it in sentiment. To the delight of the Lancashire men the Americans manned ship, their band played God Save the King, and generally they did us proud. The division was keen to show its appreciation. The band of the 8th Manchesters, uncertain whether Yankee Doodle, the Star-Spangled Banner, or My Country, 'Tis of Thee, is considered the national anthem of the United States, and doubting their ability to render either of the first 2 airs pleasingly, the third tune being that of our own national anthem, and therefore open to misconstruction, struck up marching through Georgia. All too late came the reflection that possibly the cruiser's complement had been drawn from states which might not appreciate this air. However, every one seemed delighted by the display of cousinly emotion, and felt the better for the incident. Arrival in Egypt. The disembarkation, which began the same day, was watched critically by regular officers who were waiting to embark for France, and who expressed their delight at the fine appearance and soldierly bearing of the territorials. The first troops to land went on by Trained to Cairo, where the Yeomanry, the Lancashire Fusiliers Brigade, the Signal Company, and the Transport and Supply Column took over Abasia Barracks. The East Lancashire Brigade were partly in the Citadel and Kasra el Nil Barracks in Cairo and partly in camp on the Heliopolis racecourse. The artillery also encamped on the racecourse, and the engineers occupied the Kasra el Nil Barracks. The 5th, 6th, and 8th Battalions of the Manchester Brigade and 1 Company of the 7th Manchesters remained in Alexandria as garrison, the greater part being quartered in the Mustafa Barracks and camp, while detachments were accommodated in the forts of Ras el Tin and Qam el Dik. Later, half of this company of the 7th was sent to Cyprus. The other 3 companies of the battalion had been sent to Khartoum via Port Sudan. Detachments of the RAMC accompanied the 7th Manchesters to Cyprus and Khartoum. But the field ambulances as units remained with their affiliated brigades, the 1st at Alexandria, the 2nd at Heliopolis, and the 3rd at Abasia. Detachments of the T&S column took over ASC duties from the regulars at Alexandria, Khartoum, and Cyprus. Abasia was chosen for divisional headquarters. Khaki helmets were quickly issued, but as the embarkation staff had put the tropical clothing in bulk in one ship, some time elapsed before the heavy serge could be discarded in favor of light drill, and it was astonishing how well the younger lads endured the excessive heat. They showed their grit from the start. The usual conditions of issue were experienced. When only the smaller sizes in headgear, boots, and clothing are available, how is it that so large a proportion of big-footed, big-headed, big-framed men turns up? The sun helmets were approved. Bill, will they let us tack these? Woam wi us, one man was heard to ask. Bill was not one of the many optimists who took for granted that they would be home for Christmas. Th'll be lucky if tha tax t'yed woam, never mind t'emlad, he replied. Many of the horses had died on the voyage, for not only were the ships ill-fitted for horse transport, but orders had been received from the War Office, in spite of the divisional commander's expostulations, not to exceed 1 man to every 6 horses. It was not possible for so small a proportion of men, most of whom were inexperienced, to cope with so many animals. On one boat alone, the Norseman, an Australian emigrant boat, there were more than 700 horses in charge of 95 men, and 46 animals died during the voyage. The horses at first suffered greatly from climatic conditions, and especially from sand colic. One apparently decided to lay a protest before the highest quarter, so, evading the picket, it made its way through a narrow gate into the garden of the CRA, and lay down to die almost on the general's doorstep. The veterinary officers had a busy time, and a story concerning one of these was told with much enjoyment by General Maxwell himself. The vet was working at the highest pressure, when a gentleman in civil garb came along and, proceeding to ask him sundry questions, was curtly requested to seek the nether regions and mind his own business there. His horror on discovering later that his abuse had been levelled at the head of the commander-in-chief may be imagined. Lord Kitchener had asked the territorials to push on with their training, and General Douglas had assured him that all ranks were animated by a keen desire to fit themselves for whatever service might be required of them. Training had now begun in earnest, and before long a new stimulus, a fresh incentive, to efficiency appeared, and the prospect of the division's participation in actual warfare became less remote. During October the suspicion that Turkey might take the plunge and declare herself on the side of the enemy had become a probability. an attempt to incite Egypt to revolt. And, indeed, to persuade Mohammedans throughout the world that the day had dawned when a swift blow should destroy British supremacy forever, might confidently be looked for, and an attack upon the Suez Canal would surely follow. To Mohammedans, with the exception of the comparatively feeble Shia sect, the Sultan of Turkey was the defender of the faith, the representative of the Prophet. Who could say what religious fanaticism might not accomplish if he should proclaim jihad against the infidels? The situation was grave, it might become critical, for the Khedive's good faith was distrusted, and with reason. The regular army of occupation had left Egypt for France and Flanders, and Lancashire civilians, clerks, warehousemen, artisans, mill hands, merchants, professional men were responsible for law and order in the ancient land of the pharaohs, for its defense and for the safeguarding of the Suez Canal and the communications between West and East. They kept their charge inviolate, and during 8 months, amid strange surroundings and under trying conditions of climate, the East Lancashire Division gained the confidence of the administration and the respect and esteem of British colony and native population alike, by their efficiency, their grit, and their exemplary conduct. As soldiers under fire they had yet to be tested, as men they were proved and approved. Lancashire, and indeed, the whole territorial force, have reason to be proud of the first civilian army that was placed in a position of grave responsibility. On the 22nd of October intelligence was received of considerable Turkish activity in the Sinai Peninsula. We were still at peace with Turkey, but it was highly probable that a surprise attack upon the Suez Canal might precede a formal declaration of war. The canal had been patrolled by a battalion of Highland Light Infantry until early in October, when its duties had been taken over by Indian troops. To strengthen the canal defences, the 1st and 2nd Field Companies, RE, were sent to Ismailia on October 26 and 27, and a few days later a detachment of the Signal Company and the machine gun sections of the 5th Battalion, East Lancashires, and 10th Battalion, Manchesters, also left Cairo for the canal zone. The sappers bridged the canal in 3 places, manned the searchlights, supplied crews for steam tugs. It was in consequence of an explosion on one of these boats that the first casualties of the division occurred. Lieutenant Woods and 6 non-commissioned officers and men being killed supervised the water supply, destroyed the native village of Kantara, and built fortifications. The Signal Company laid a cable between Kantara, Ismailia, and Suez, and the motorcycle dispatch riders of this company were the first ever employed on active service outside Europe. The work of the engineers received much valued commendation from the Commander-in-Chief. A section each of the 2nd and 3rd Field Ambulances had been sent to Ismailia and Kantara respectively to be attached to the canal defences, and these gave what assistance was needed to Indian troops, as well as to the men of their own division. Another section of the 2nd Field Ambulance took charge of the Australian hospital at Mina, at which place, and also at Meaty and Zytown, the East Lancashire Transport and Supply Column had formed depots and undertaken transport duties for the Anzacs until their own ASC units arrived. On October 31 a force of nearly 9,000 yeomanry and territorials marched through the streets of Cairo. Such a display of troops had never before been seen by the natives, and they were much impressed. At a critical time, the Commander-in-Chief, Sir John Maxwell, expressed his appreciation of the splendid appearance of the men, and of the salutary effect of the parade on the Egyptians. Native agitators and German and Turkish agents had for some time been active in Egypt and the Sudan, seeking to discredit the Allies, and one of these did his best to convince spectators that what they took to be a powerful force was in reality but a stage army, the same unit marching in a circle. On November 1 martial law was proclaimed throughout Egypt and the Sudan. On the 5th of November, war was declared against Turkey. The island of Cyprus was formally annexed on the 7th. 2 companies of the 8th Manchesters had relieved the half company of the 7th Manchesters as garrison on October 20, and detachments were sent to the various towns of the island to prevent disturbances between Greeks and Turks when the proclamation was made. On December 20 Prince Hussein was declared Sultan of Egypt under British protectorate, and the 5th Lancashire Fusiliers provided a guard of honor on the occasion of the formal entry of the new Sultan into his capital. In Alexandria and Khartoum the Manchesters had ceremonial marches through the towns. Work and play. For some months the division was occupied in strenuous training. The men suffered from the heat, the glare of the sun, the dust, sandstorms, flies, and other plagues of Egypt, the remarkable drop in temperature at night, the long, shadeless, desert marches, but they took it all cheerfully as part of the day's work, and by the end of the year 1914 they were fairly well acclimatized and thoroughly fit. There was play as well as work: cricket, rugger, soccer, lacrosse, and hockey teams were soon hard at it, concert parties and Pierrot troops discovered unsuspected talent. There were also boxing contests, and the race meetings on Gezira Island provided many dinners at the Continental and Shepherds for the winners. Full advantage was taken of the opportunities given at weekends to visit the marvels of Egypt. The hospitality of the British colonies at Cairo, Alexandria, and elsewhere was warmly appreciated, and many friendships were formed between the residents and the men from Lancashire. The good feeling and comradeship that prevailed throughout the division may be illustrated by an incident, slight but typical. On the occasion of some special parade the 5th Manchesters had to cross the very sandy parade ground before reaching the asphalt road that led out of barracks. Noticing the dusty state of their boots, the men of D Company of the 6th Manchesters darted into their quarters, which were close at hand, and, producing brushes and rags, they quickly polished the boots of the Wigan men. It was a trifling incident, but still a perfect expression of the spirit of good comradeship. And it had a wonderful and lasting effect. The 2 battalions were knit more closely together, and later, in Gallipoli, there was a sense of absolute security in either battalion in the knowledge that the other was in support. The first Christmas on active service was celebrated in traditional style, plum puddings and other Christmas fare being sent out by friends at home. The old hymns and carols at the morning service stirred the emotions deeply, and thoughts of home and memories of bygone Christmas gatherings became poignant. Dining huts and messes, rooms and verandas, were garlanded with palm branches, flowers, lanterns, and chains of colored paper. Nothing was omitted to make the day a memorable and happy one, and one to look back upon. Still, there were some decidedly novel features. Chief of which, perhaps, was the after-dinner swim in the sea, indulged in by a number of Manchester men in Alexandria. On Boxing Day, a great sports meeting was held at the Gezira Sporting Club, Cairo. And many Lancashire men were successful competitors. They were, however, outshone by the men of the Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps, whose prowess was hailed with enthusiasm by their territorial and yeomanry rivals. Casual mention only has been made of the 7th Manchesters, as The greater part of this battalion occupied a position of splendid isolation. Its very interesting experiences must be referred to separately, and all too briefly. B Company had been dropped at Alexandria to take over the duties of a company of the Suffolk Regiment in that town and in Cyprus, and the other 3 companies remained on board the troop ship. Port Sudan was reached on September 30th. After a 5 days voyage, and the warm reception given them by the Suffolks and the British officials was very welcome. After 4 weeks at sea, half of C Company was left to garrison Port Sudan and, later, among other duties, to patrol the Red Sea in HMS Enterprise, and to run an armored train. The rest of the battalion entrained for Khartoum, a journey of 600 kilometers, where, on October 2nd, they were welcomed by the Sirdar, Sir F.R. Wingate, and his staff. Khartoum and the Sudan furnished a succession of novel experiences to the men from Burlington Street, but no surprise quite equaled that conveyed to them by the intimation that they were at once, without preliminary coaching, to supply a half-company to form the British Camel Corps. The 2 platoons of C Company were detailed for this duty. The departing OC Camel Corps had little time in which to impart information to his successor, and there were many documents to sign, some of these being in Arabic. He seemed grieved that Manchester men should be ignorant of Arabic and of the customs, habits, and requirements of camels, but volunteered as much information as could be crammed into 5 minutes. Captain C. Norbury and his subalterns gazed upon their new pets, 70 in number, without affection, and sat down the better to enjoy the humor of their predicament before sampling its difficulties. In despair and not in hope, expecting rather to provoke merriment than to elicit information, the new OC camels asked his half-company if any man among them had had experience of camels. Forth stepped the former camel keeper of Bostock's menagerie. The hour had brought forth the man. The 7th Manchesters now felt that they were equal to any emergency, and soon they provided piano tuners for the Sirdar's palace, trained gardeners for the barracks gardens, and skilled artisans for every variety of job for which an expert was demanded. The Camel Corps was soon proficient enough to be sent by the Sirdar on a 2 weeks' trek through villages where white men had rarely been seen, and their presence gave the lie to reports circulated by Turco-German emissaries that all white troops had been recalled from Egypt and the Sudan to defend their home country from the enemy at its gates. Incidentally, they had the opportunity of seeing the wonderful results of Manchester enterprise in the great cotton-growing areas through which they passed. Not only had Khartoum been transformed from a collection of mud huts into a town of imposing buildings, shops, and public works, but the savage Sudan of a few years ago was in process of transformation into a land of peace and prosperity. Training proceeded under the same trying conditions of climate experienced by their comrades in Egypt, the same games and sports were enjoyed with similar zest, and fitness and efficiency prevailed. The conduct of the men received and merited high praise from the Sirdar, who paid the battalion the distinction of becoming its honorary colonel, and from all with whom they came in contact. Relations with the natives were excellent, and a firm friendship was formed with the Egyptian regiment in Khartoum. The first of all active service periodicals, the Manchester Sentry, was published in Khartoum, the Sirdar and Lady Wingate contributing. The 3 companies rejoined their comrades of the Manchester Brigade in Cairo on April 23, 1915. Defense of the Suez Canal. On January 19, 1915, the Manchester Brigade was transferred from Alexandria and Cyprus to Cairo, and the 5th and 8th Lancashire Fusiliers were sent to Alexandria. Reports of renewed activity on the part of the Turks pointed to an attempt to seize the Suez Canal and invade Egypt. On January 20 the 1st and 3rd Brigades RFA were dispatched to the canal zone, to be followed a few days later by the 1st Field Company, RE, which had recently been brought back to Cairo in order to take part in divisional training. The artillery was posted on the west bank of the canal at El Kubri, Serapum West, Ferry Post, Ismailia, El Ferdin, and Kantara. Most of the guns being concealed among the pines that grow within 100 yards of the bank. The field companies assisted the garrisons of Indian troops in the strong points of the east bank to improve their defenses. The expectations of hostile attack were realized in the early hours of February 3, when a force of 12,000 Turks and Germans attacked and made an attempt to cross the canal midway between the east bank strong points of Serapum and Tausum. Heavy rifle and machine gun fire developed between those places about 3 a.m. The guns of the Egyptian mountain battery had, by happy chance or remarkable intuition, been mounted on the west bank within 400 yards of the main crossing place selected by the Turks. The shanty of the enemy, as, unaware of the battery's proximity, he attempted to launch the heavy steel pontoons, was much appreciated by the gunners, who opened fire in the dark at point-blank range. When daylight came, the battery commander was able to congratulate himself on some accurate spotting, several holed pontoons, and many dead Turks being found at the water's edge. One of these pontoons is now in possession of the Manchester Corporation. 2 sections of the 1st Field Company had been detailed to hold the west bank at this point, and in the course of the fighting on February 3 they lost 1 man killed and 2 wounded. The 19th Battery, under Major B.P. Dobson, which had already been in action on the previous day against the Turkish Camel Corps, played a conspicuous part in the enemy's defeat. They had hauled 1 15-pounder through a wood to the bank of the canal and had fired point blank into the Turks as they vainly attempted to launch their iron boats. Another gun was man-hauled to a hill behind the wood, and this found good targets as the enemy approached the canal. Captain P.K. Clapham did some good spotting for the battery from a precarious and exposed position in a tall fir tree.